He was 18 years old and had been sleeping in a public parking garage on Drayton Street in Savannah, Georgia, for 11 days when he bought the Crumbling Victorian on West Gwinnett for $5. Not 500. 5. The price was on the deed, next to his name, next to the address of a house that the city had been trying to get rid of for 3 years, and that nobody had wanted because the roof had buckled. On one side, and the front porch had collapsed, and the wraparound had rotted off in sections, and the whole thing sat under 2 enormous live oaks draped with Spanish moss, and looked in the particular way that ruined Victorians look in coastal Georgia in July, like something the heat had been quietly eating for a very long time. He had $5 because he had 6. And the filing fee for the city's emergency property transfer program was 1. And behind the sealed door on the second floor of that house, a door that had been nailed shut from the outside with 16 finishing nails and had not been opened in 62 years, was something that nobody in that neighborhood had ever seen. And that changed the course of Marcus Lyle's life in ways that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with what it meant to have someone prepare a place for you before you knew you were coming. We are glad you're here for this one. If this channel has ever given you a story you needed, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe and let us know where you're watching from in the comments today. His name was Marcus Lyle, and he had grown up inside the Georgia foster care system in the specific way that some children grow up inside institutions, learning its language, its rhythms, its unspoken rules about what to ask for and what not to expect. He had been placed 11 times between the age of 4 and the age of 17 in homes that ranged from genuinely kind to genuinely difficult, with most of the range in between. He was not a child who caused trouble. He was a child who learned very early to be useful and unobtrusive, to take up exactly as much space as was offered and no more, to be pleasant in the manner of someone who has understood that pleasantness is a form of self-protection. He read everything he could get his hands on. He was good at math. He had a particular gift for fixing things, mechanical things, structural things. Anything that had stopped working and needed someone to understand why, that had never been formally recognized or encouraged because the system he lived in was not organized around recognizing particular gifts. He aged out on a Tuesday in March, which was his 18th birthday. His caseworker, a woman named Prentice who had managed his file for the last 2 years and who was not unkind, but who was overworked in the precise way that makes the difference between seeing a person and processing them, sat across from him at a small table in a county office and explained his situation. He had 90 days of transitional housing available. He had a bus pass. He had a form that would connect him to job training services if he pursued it. She slid the folder across the table and said, "You've done well, Marcus. You're going to be fine." Then she looked at the clock above the door. He took the folder. He said thank you. He left. He spent 61 of his 90 transitional days in a shared room in a facility on the south side of Savannah that smelled of industrial cleaner and other people's exhaustion. He spent them applying for jobs and attending the job training and doing the things the folder said to do. Because he was the kind of person who did the things that were required of him, and who believed, in the way that some people believe things before life has given them enough evidence one way or the other, that following the process would produce the promised result. It did not produce the promised result, exactly. It produced a part-time position at a hardware store on Abercorn Street that paid $11 an hour and was not enough, by a precise and measurable amount, to afford the cheapest room he could find. When his 90 days ended, he had $43 and a job and no place to sleep. He slept in the parking garage on Drayton Street because it was covered and because the security guard who worked the overnight shift, a man named Wendell, who was 63, and had worked that garage for 14 years, had looked at him once on his first night and said nothing, and had continued to say nothing on the nights that followed. And Marcus understood that this was an act of deliberate generosity rather than oversight, and tried not to make it complicated. He found the city's emergency property transfer program on a handout taped to the bulletin board at the job training center, which he still visited on Thursdays because there was coffee and he'd gotten into the habit. The program was designed to transfer long delinquent properties with structural issues to individuals willing to assume the tax debt and commit to restoration. The application required proof of intent and a fee. The fee was $1 per year of delinquency. The Victorian on West Gwinnett had been delinquent for 5 years. He filled out the application at the library on Bull Street on a computer over 2 evenings. He wrote in the section marked Statement of Intent that he was a trained hardware and home repair employee with knowledge of basic structural assessment, that he intended to make the property habitable and to live in it, and that he had nowhere else to go. He was not sure whether that last sentence was appropriate for a city application, but he included it because it was true, and he had found, by 18, that true things were usually more persuasive than careful ones. The city approved the application in 6 weeks. A woman in the property office named Cecilia Odom called to tell him and to schedule the transfer signing, and when he arrived at her office, she looked at his application for a moment, and then looked at him and said, in a matter-of-fact voice that carried no pity and no condescension, "The previous owner died 3 years ago, at 94. She had no heirs. She left a letter with the property records that said the house should go to whoever needed it most. We've been trying to find that person." She paused. "I think the letter had you in mind." He signed the papers. She handed him the key. It was an old key, skeleton style, heavy brass, the kind that had been made when the locket fit was new and the house was new and the city was different. He turned it over in his hand. "What do I do with this?" he said. She smiled. "Go home," she said. He drove to West Gwinnett in the hardware store's parking lot's worth of late afternoon light, in a city bus because he didn't have a car, and he stood in front of the house for the first time as its owner. It was a ruin. It was a specific, architectural, almost beautiful ruin. The kind that Savannah produces better than almost anywhere else in the country, because Savannah's heat and humidity and the particular quality of its neglect can take a Victorian and return it to something that looks organic, as if the house is trying to become a tree again. The front porch was gone, except for the posts, which still stood at irregular angles like the remnants of a colonnade. The wraparound had pulled away from the house on the south side and hung at an angle. The roof had buckled on the west end, visibly, the ridgeline dipping where something structural had given way. The windows were intact, all of them, which astonished him. Old wavy glass behind wrought iron security bars that had rusted to an even orange-brown. 2 of the 3 chimneys were still plumb. The third listed slightly east. He walked around the full perimeter. Slowly, he put his hand on the foundation at the corners. Poured concrete. Solid. He pressed on the siding in 3 places to check for rot. He stood at the back of the house and looked at the rear elevation, which faced a lane that ran between the houses, and which was in somewhat better repair than the front, because it was shaded by a magnolia that had grown large enough to shelter it. It was a gamble. He knew that. He knew it in the specific way that a person knows a gamble when they have no alternative to the gamble. When the gamble is simply what is available, and the question is not whether to take it, but whether to take it seriously. He took it seriously. He went back to the front and put the key in the lock and turned it, and the door swung inward on hinges that complained, but held, and he stepped inside. The house smelled of age and plaster dust, and something faintly sweet that he couldn't identify until he looked up and saw the remains of what had once been wallpaper, a flower pattern, roses or something like them, faded to a suggestion of color, clinging to the plaster in sections and releasing from it in others. The entry hall was wide. The ceilings were high, 11 feet, maybe 12. The staircase against the right wall was intact, solid banistered, the wood dark with age and finish. He put his hand on the newel post and pressed. It didn't move. He went room by room on the ground floor. Parlor, dining room, kitchen, a small back room that had been a pantry. The floors were heart pine throughout, wide plank, buried under decades of dust but fundamentally sound. The kitchen had been updated at some point in the 1950s, the original fireplace boxed in and a range installed in its place, the range long since removed, leaving a gas line capped at the wall. The pantry had shelves that ran floor to ceiling, empty, the wood of them the color of old honey. He came back to the staircase. He went up. The second floor had 3 rooms and a bathroom that had been added to the back of the house at the same time as the kitchen update, sharing its vintage. 2 of the 3 rooms were empty and accessible, their doors standing open on emptiness and dust and the particular quiet of rooms that have not held a person in years. The third door was at the end of the hall, and it was sealed. Not locked. Sealed. Someone had taken 16 finishing nails, he counted them later, and driven them through the doorframe into the door itself, in 2 columns of 8, spaced evenly, with the care of someone who was closing something deliberately and permanently, and wanted it to stay closed. The nails had been painted over, which told him the sealing had happened before the last time the hall was painted, which the condition of the paint suggested was sometime in the 1970s at the latest. He stood in front of the door for a while. He did not open it that day. He went back to the parking garage that night, and he lay in his sleeping bag on the concrete and looked at the garage ceiling and thought about a door that someone had sealed with 16 finishing nails and then painted over and left that way for however long it had been left. He thought about what you sealed a door for. Not to keep something out. You locked a door for that. You sealed a door to preserve what was inside, to protect it from the ordinary intrusions of time and air and people opening things without knowing what they were opening. He went back the next morning with a pry bar. He worked the nails out one at a time, carefully, without damaging the frame. He set each nail in a line on the hall floor as he removed it. When he had all 16, he stood back and looked at the door. It had a brass knob, tarnished to near black. He put his hand on it and paused. Then he opened it. The room was a child's bedroom. That was the first thing he understood, not gradually, but immediately, the way you understand some things the moment you see them. A bed against the far wall, a single bed with an iron frame painted white. The mattress still on it with a white coverlet that had gone ivory with age, but that had been smoothed flat with the care of someone making a bed for the last time. A small wooden dresser beside it, 4 drawers, the top one holding a hand mirror and a comb and a ribbon in pale yellow, laid out as if ready for morning. Bookshelves on the wall to the left, filled, actually filled, spine to spine, with children's books that Marcus recognized some of and didn't recognize others, the kind of library a child builds book by book over the years of childhood when each new book is an event. A small desk under the window with a wooden chair pulled neatly up to it, and a composition notebook closed on the surface, and a cup of pencils beside it. The pencils still sharp, sharpened by someone who had intended to come back. On the wall above the desk, in a 9-year-old's handwriting, he understood instinctively it was 9. That particular combination of practiced letters and unsteady spacing was a name written in pencil directly on the plaster. May. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not go in. Not yet. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room that had been waiting, sealed and preserved and kept exactly as it was. for 62 years. He went to find out who May was. Stay with this one, if you will. There's more to come, and it matters. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. We'll be right here. The neighbor who could tell him was a woman named Delphine Okafor, who was 78 years old and had lived in the house directly south of the Victorian on West Gwinnett for 41 years. She had known the previous owner, Cora Beaumont, for all 41 of those years, and had known about the house for longer. Because Cora was the kind of woman whose presence on a street reorganized the street around her, the way a large tree reorganizes the light. She invited Marcus in when he knocked, without hesitation, in the way of people who have lived long enough to know when a young person needs a kitchen table and a glass of sweet tea, and someone who will tell them the truth. Cora's granddaughter, she said when Marcus asked about May. Margaret Elaine Beaumont. Everybody called her May. She died in the summer of 1962. She was 9 years old. She looked at her glass. Fever. Something went wrong very fast. Cora had her in the room one morning, and she was gone by nightfall. She paused. Cora never talked about it directly. But she sealed that room the week after, and she never opened it again, and anybody on this street who knew Cora understood what that meant. Marcus waited. She was the kind of woman, Delphine said, who held things inside herself, so that other people didn't have to carry them. That was her way. She had her grief, and she kept it to herself, and what she put out into the world was something else. Something useful. She looked at him. What do you know about her? Almost nothing, Marcus said. Delphine set her glass down. Then, let me tell you. What she told him took the better part of 2 hours, with refills of the tea and a plate of butter cookies that appeared from somewhere in the kitchen. And it was this. Cora Beaumont had lived in that house for 70 years. From the time she married at 24 to the time she died at 94. And in those 70 years, she had been the fixed point around which the neighborhood moved. Not loudly. She hadn't been a loud woman. But she had paid attention to children, specifically the children of the neighborhood, the ones who were struggling, the ones who fell through, the ones who needed things that their circumstances didn't provide. She kept school supplies, Delphine said. Every September, a box by her front door, notebooks, pencils, crayons, folders. Any child who needed supplies for school could come to her door and take what they needed. No questions. No paperwork. Just the box. She shook her head. She did that for 40 years. Every September. Nobody told her to, and nobody paid her to, and she never made a thing of it. Children would come from 2 streets over. She never asked their names, never asked why they needed it. You'd see them going up her walk in the mornings and coming back down with something in their hands, and she'd be somewhere else in the house, not watching, giving them the dignity of it. She paused. After she died that September, there was nothing on the porch. I think half the children on the block didn't know what to do. They'd never known a September without that box. She had also, Delphine said, made a habit of sitting on her porch in the late afternoons and watching the street. And when she saw something she understood that needed addressing, a child sitting alone on a stoop too many days in a row, a young person who had the look of someone with nowhere to go, she had a way of finding an indirect path to that person that did not involve pity or intrusion. A job mentioned to the right person. A recommendation made to someone who could use a young worker. A word said in the right ear that opened a door without anyone being made to feel the door needed opening. She watched for the ones who had nothing, Delphine said, the ones the system had used up and put down. She said once, and I never forgot this, she said, the ones nobody is watching for are the ones worth watching for the most. Marcus was quiet. She talked about the house, Delphine said. In the last years, she'd stopped being able to do much, physically, and she'd sit on the porch when the weather was good and we'd talk across the fence. She said she was deciding what to do with it. She said it should go to someone who needed it more than they needed anything she could put in a will. Someone who would understand the room. She looked at him. I think she meant May's room. He drove back to the Victorian, walked. Actually, he didn't have a car, and went upstairs and stood in the doorway of May's room again. He understood something now that he hadn't understood before. The room had not been sealed as a shrine to grief. Exactly. It had been sealed as a gift. A preserved space, kept whole and intact, for someone who had never had a room that was theirs. For someone who had slept in 11 different beds in 14 years, and had never once been able to put a name on the wall in pencil and expect it to still be there in the morning. The fireproof box was in the closet, on the top shelf, behind a stack of folded sweaters that had kept their shape despite the decades. He would have found it eventually, even without Delphine's suggestion, but Delphine had mentioned it. Cora said she'd left some papers in the room, in the closet, for whoever came, and so he looked. Inside the box, a deed to an adjacent vacant lot that Cora had purchased in 1988 for $1,200, and that the county assessor now valued, per the most recent assessment, at $214,000. A savings passbook from a credit union, in the name of the house's future owner, left blank where a name should go, showing a balance of $22,800 that Cora had deposited in installments over the last 15 years of her life, and a letter, in the handwriting of a 90-year-old woman who had written it carefully, understanding she would not get another chance. The letter said, I don't know your name. I don't know what brought you here, but I know something did. This house has a way of finding the people it needs. May's room is yours. What's in this box is yours. The lot next door is yours. Use it carefully and use it well, and when you have the chance, watch for the ones nobody is watching for. That's all I ask. Cora Beaumont. He sat on the floor of the hallway outside May's room and read the letter twice. Then, he folded it along its original crease and held it in both hands for a while. He moved in that weekend. He slept in the parlor on his sleeping bag, on the heart pine floor. Because the parlor was the most structurally sound room, and because it meant he could hear the whole house, the sounds it made settling, the sounds the old live oaks made when the wind moved, the particular silence of a house that had been empty for 3 years and was now occupied again. He lay on his back in the dark and listened, and did not feel alone, which surprised him. He had grown up feeling alone in houses full of people. This house, empty, did not feel that way. A man named Gerald Oates found him 2 weeks later, or rather found the house. Gerald had driven past the Victorian for years and had a long professional interest in its structure. Because Gerald was a preservation contractor who specialized in Savannah's historic properties and who had been hoping someone would take on this house before it passed the point of return. He knocked one Saturday morning, and Marcus let him in, and they walked through the house together for 2 hours, room by room, while Gerald made notes and asked questions, and occasionally crouched to look at something and made small sounds of either satisfaction or concern. At the end of the walk through, Gerald stood in the entry hall and looked up at the ceiling, which still had its original plaster medallion intact above where a light fixture had once been. "You know what you have," Gerald said. It wasn't a question. "I'm learning," Marcus said. Gerald looked at him. "How old are you?" 18. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he named a figure for a phased restoration plan that was lower than Marcus had feared, and came with a payment timeline that accounted for the fact that Marcus was going to be doing the non-skilled portions himself. "I've worked with a lot of people on a lot of houses," Gerald said. "I don't usually offer this kind of arrangement. Why are you offering it now?" Gerald looked around the entry hall again. "Because Cora Beaumont's house deserves to be saved by someone who gives a damn about it," he said. "And because you clearly give a damn about it." The news reached Marcus that fall in the way unexpected news tends to reach people who have remade themselves at a distance from where they started, by finding them when they'd stopped looking for it. His former caseworker, Prentice, had seen something in the county property records. A transfer notice, his name on a historic property on West Gwinnett, and had mentioned it to someone at the county foster services office who had mentioned it to someone else. And eventually a short piece appeared in a Savannah neighborhood newsletter about a young man who had aged out of foster care and acquired a Victorian on the historic register and was restoring it. The piece was brief and factual. It did not ask for anything, and Marcus did not read it until someone at the hardware store printed it and left it on the break room table. He read it once. He set it down. He thought about a folder slid across a table on a Tuesday in March. A woman looking at a clock above a door. A sentence, "You're going to be fine," delivered to a space between his face and the wall because she had not quite been able to look at him while she said it. He did not feel anger toward her. She had been doing what she was trained to do within a system that had trained her to process rather than to see. And that was a sadness that belonged to the system, not to her personally. He felt, mostly, the distance between that table and this house, which was something he was still measuring and would probably be measuring for a long time. He sent no response. He went back to the house. By the following spring, the roof was repaired and the porch was rebuilt. Gerald had matched the porch posts to the originals using patterns found in the Savannah Historical Archive. The wraparound was back. The Victorian on West Gwinnett stood on its corner under the live oaks and looked, for the first time in 20 years, like what it was. May's room he restored last, and most carefully. He kept everything where it was: the white iron bed, the dresser, the bookshelves, the composition notebook on the desk, the cup of pencils, the ribbon. He cleaned the surfaces gently. He repaired the plaster where it had cracked and repainted it the exact shade of pale yellow the walls had been, matching a remnant he found behind the door. He did not repaint the name above the desk. He left it exactly as it was, in May's pencil, in May's 9-year-old hand, because some things deserved to stay where they were put. He kept a box by the front door starting in September. Notebooks, pencils, colored markers, folders. He did not put a sign on it. He just put the box there, and the word moved the way word moves on streets where people pay attention to each other, and the children came. A girl of about 8 stopped on the sidewalk one afternoon and looked at the box, and then looked at the house, and then looked at Marcus, who was sitting on the rebuilt porch with a book. "Is that for anybody?" she said. "For anybody who needs it," he said. She considered this. "What's the catch?" No catch. She came up the walk and looked in the box carefully, the way a child looks at something she's been told is too good to be true and is deciding whether to believe it. She took a composition notebook and 2 pencils. She looked at him again. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said, and went back to his book. She came back the following week with a friend. The week after that, 4 of them came. By October, the box needed restocking twice a week, which he did without comment, because Cora Beaumont had done it for 40 years without comment, and he was learning. The ones nobody is watching for are the ones worth watching for the most. He said it to himself sometimes, in the early mornings, when he was the first one up, and the house was quiet, and the live oaks were doing what live oaks do in the long light of a Savannah morning, which is to hold everything underneath them in a kind of dappled, patient shade. He hadn't read those words until the box in the closet. But he had been living them since he was 4 years old, on the other side of them, the side where you are the one not being watched, and so he understood them in a way that went deeper than reading. There is a particular kind of faith that doesn't announce itself. It builds things in the dark and seals them up and waits without knowing how long it will have to wait, trusting that the world is the kind of place where the right person eventually arrives. Cora Beaumont had that faith. She exercised it over 94 years on a street in Savannah, in a house full of wide plank floors and high ceilings and the ghost of a wallpaper pattern that used to be roses, and in a room at the end of a hall that she kept whole because she believed it would matter to someone she would never meet. He was homeless at 18 and bought a Crumbling Victorian for $5. What was behind the sealed door was a child's room kept whole for 62 years, and a fireproof box, and a letter from a woman he never met, who had been watching for him longer than he'd been alive. He is still on West Gwinnett. The porch is sound. May's name is still on the wall above the desk, and in September, there is a box by the front door. If this story meant something to you, we'd love for you to subscribe. It takes 1 moment, and it means a great deal to this channel. Share it today with someone who needs it. And here is our question, and we ask it sincerely. Was there ever a time in your life when you found something, a place, a person, a letter, a moment, that made you feel, for the first time, that someone had been expecting you? Tell us about it in the comments. We will be reading every one. See you in the next one.